Reincarnation did not begin, as many people think, with people who are New Age people. It's absolutely amazing if you think back that reincarnation began with some of the greatest minds that ever lived in history. I'm going to go back as far back as the 5th century BC. Pythagoras was one of the great Greek minds in the Greek of all the Greek philosophers. He died in 500 CB. He was born in 582 BC, which means 582 years before Jeshua was born, and he died in 507 BC. And Pythagoras not only believed in reincarnation, but he actually claimed that he had the total memory of some of his soul's past lives, that he had the complete memory in his soul mind of a previous life he had lived as a person known as Aethalidius. I know I'm not pronouncing it right, who also then was reborn after that lifetime to Euphorbus. So back in the 5th century, before Jeshua was born, Pythagoras was talking about the memory of 2 previous lifetimes he had had. And then we take a look at the lifetime of Plato and Socrates. In 348 BC, and 348 years before Jeshua was born, Plato and Socrates talked about reincarnation, and they wrote a book called The Republic, in which reincarnation was discussed within their book, 348 years before Jeshua was born. And Aristotle was born not too long after Socrates and Plato. He was actually one of teacher of Plato's, and he believed in reincarnation. He stated in a number of different writings that the soul of man is immortal and can perform its proper functions by continuing to transmigrate into different physical bodies in different lifetimes. Another word for reincarnation was the transmigration of the soul, which means it was transmigrating into another body. Plutarch was another of the great philosophers, and he was born 120 years before Jeshua was born, and he died 46 years before Jeshua was born. And he stated that every soul is ordained to wander between incarnations in the spiritual world until driven down again to earth and coupled with human bodies. Now, the way they described reincarnation may be different than you and I know it to be, but the important message is that these are some of the great minds of the past, before Christianity, before Jeshua was born, that believed in reincarnation. You don't have to take notes because, as you know, Marianne is going to put this show on the archives, and at times when you have discussions with some of your friends who tell you that reincarnation is not true, you can share some of the things I'm going to be sharing with you today to prove to them that some of the greatest minds in the world throughout history believed in reincarnation. What percentage of the population do you think in the United States believes in reincarnation today? I think you're shocked to find out, according to the latest Gallup poll, only 20% of the people in the United States believe in reincarnation. Only 20%. So there are many, many people that do not believe in reincarnation that you'll have the opportunity to have conversations with and share with them how some of the greatest minds in the world believe in reincarnation. And then in a little while we'll be getting into why reincarnation is so important. Julius Caesar, who died 44 years before Jeshua was born, Julius Caesar himself said that souls do not become extinct, but they pass after death from one body to another body. And Cicero, who was a great philosopher at the time of Julius Caesar, he stated that the strong proof of men knowing most things before birth, and when they are children, they grasp innumerable facts with such speed to show that they're not taking them in for the first time. They have knowledge of them before, but they remember them and recall them from their past lives. The children recall their past lives. This is Cicero, one of the great philosophers in the century before Jeshua was born, stated this. And Virgil, I mention these people because these people are people who are very, very famous philosophers the time before Jeshua. Virgil died 19 years before Jeshua was born. And he stated during his lifetime, quote, all the souls after they have passed away are summoned by the divine ones again. In this way they become forgetful of their former earth life and revisit the grounds of the world, willing to return again into new living bodies. Virgil said that in the 1st century before Jeshua was born. And amazingly enough, that Constantine created in the 4th century the Roman Catholic Church, the Emperor Constantine. He had a nephew named Julian. And Julian was the emperor who then proceeded to become the emperor after Constantine. And Julian, who lived in the 4th century, the emperor after Constantine, he himself said that he himself was a reincarnation. He believed that he was a reincarnation of Alexander the Great. I don't know if he was the reincarnation of Alexander the Great, but here we have the emperor after Constantine, who in the 4th century after Constantine formed the Roman Catholic Church, saying he himself thought that he was the reincarnation of Alexander the Great. There have been many, many great minds throughout history. And as I mentioned to you, it's taken me a tremendous amount of research of many, many years. But Albert Schweitzer believed in reincarnation. Thomas Edison believed in reincarnation. Walt Whitman, the great poet, believed in reincarnation. Thoreau believed in reincarnation. Salvador Dali, who was a famous painter, painted murals in the early 1900s. He believed that he was a reincarnation of the famous Spanish mystic known as St. John of the Cross. And he's quoted as saying in the early 1900s, I can remember vividly my life as St. John. I can remember the monastery. I can remember many of St. John's fellow monks. Now, the reason reincarnation is so important, we have to go back to the understanding that what is the purpose of our lives? The purpose of every one of our lives is to become at one with God and Christ consciousness. And we've discussed the analogy that every one of us has a temple pyramid inside of us, 1,000 steps. And the purpose of our lives is to ascend those steps, to evolve spiritually, until eventually we reach the very, very top step. And we're at one with God and Christ consciousness. But we can't do it in one lifetime. It's impossible we will do it in one lifetime. It takes many, many, many lifetimes for us to eventually reach that top step. And if not for the gift of reincarnation that God gave us, we would never be able to eventually reach the top, to ascend spiritually, to evolve until we reach that point that we are at one with God and Christ consciousness. And this is why reincarnation is so important. And the church, of course, teaches that you only have one lifetime. Most religions teach there's only one lifetime. So what happens to a child 3 or 4 years old who dies as a result of a disease or sickness or an accident? Without reincarnation, this child could never evolve to become at one with God. Would never be able to reach the point where they could distinguish right from wrong if they died at such an early age. God would never do that to a child, to your soul. Not give this opportunity for that child to evolve spiritually, to ascend, to become at one with God and Christ consciousness. So even a simple understanding that when someone passes away at a very early age, they're not going into some netherland such as a purgatory or some place where they can't evolve, they're just a child. They're given the opportunity of their spirit and soul being born again into a newborn baby so they have another lifetime, so they can continue what their mission was, to be able to deal with the karma, to be able to deal with evolving spiritually into a higher level and ascending those 1,000-step pyramid to become at one with God. And this is why it's so important for people to understand that without reincarnation, we couldn't have this gift that God gave us to evolve spiritually, to be able to embrace universal love and universal compassion in our lives, so we can climb those steps one at a time. And I've shared with you that I have met perhaps several people in my lifetime that I felt were on those top stairs, almost at one with God, Sarah being one of them. There's no question in my mind that Sarah, this is the last incarnation Sarah would have as a person, as a human soul, because she's on that 999th step. And she's there at one with God in Christ consciousness. One of the questions that was asked during the week is, did Joshua have any past lives? And the answer is yes. Joshua had a number of past lives before he was born as Joshua. And he himself had to evolve and ascend to the point where he became at one with Christ consciousness. And I believe with all my heart and soul that he was born 2,000 years ago, where his spirit and soul had already reached a point where it was at one with Christ consciousness. But he had other lifetimes before that. And I am told that I had other lifetimes that my spirit and soul had lived with him in previous lifetimes before the one 2,000 years ago, but that's not relevant to this conversation right now. I want to share with you some of the great minds 2,000 years ago who believed in reincarnation. One of the great historians that lived in the 1st century after Joshua died on the cross was Josephus. He was such an incredible mind, a brilliant mind, that the Romans actually took him back to Rome and made him their official Roman historian. And he wrote a book in that 1st century called Antiquity of the Jews. In book 18, chapter 1, he speaks of the 3 different sects of the Judaic religion. The Sadducees, who said they did not know if the soul lives on after death, but that the Essenes and the Pharisees did believe in reincarnation. And I'm quoting directly from his book. He said, quote, "The Pharisees believe that their souls have an immortal vigor in them, and that the virtuous shall have the power to revive and live again." He also wrote in another one of his books, and by the way, he died in 100 years. He was born in 37 AD, so he was actually born 4 years after Joshua died on the cross, and he died in 100 AD. And he wrote in his book called the Jewish War Book, number 3, chapter 8, "The bodies of men are indeed mortal, and are created out of corruptible matter, but the soul is ever immortal. Do you not remember that all pure spirits, when they depart out of this life, obtain a most holy place in heaven, and they are again sent back into pure bodies, while the souls of those who have committed self-destruction are doomed to a region in the darkness?" Now, I don't believe that they're doomed to a region in the darkness, but the point was, here is a man, this great mind in the 1st century, talking about reincarnation and how souls are reborn again into pure bodies as rewards if they led a good lifetime. There was another person who lived at that time in Alexandria who was a great philosopher by the name of Judaism. And he was born 20 years before Joshua was, and he died 54 years. He died in 54 AD, which means he died approximately 2 years after Joshua died on the cross. Now, Alexandria, Egypt at that time had even more Jews living in Alexandria, Egypt, more people of the Jewish faith that lived in the entire province of Judea. Now, the province of Judea was the most populated province of the 3 provinces of Israel, because it included not only Jerusalem, but also included Bethlehem and some of the other towns and cities around Jerusalem. But there were more people who were Jewish people that lived in Alexandria at that time that actually lived in the province of Judea. And he was a great philosopher at that time. and he lived in Alexandria. And one of the things that he wrote, quote, "The air is full of souls, those who are nearest to earth, descending to be tied to mortal bodies, returning to other bodies, designed to live in them again in another lifetime." In the Kabbalah, which is the great Hebrew scriptures, the Jews absolutely believe in reincarnation. I'm going to give you a direct quote in the Kabbalah, which are the holy books dealing with the mystics of reincarnation, which included reincarnation. This is quote, "Sometimes the souls of pious Jews pass by transmigration into Gentiles, meaning those who are not members of the Jewish religion, in order that they may plead on behalf of Israel and treat them kindly." In other words, in the Kabbalah it says that the souls of people who were Jews will pass away, and when they be born in the next lifetime, they'll be born into the souls of someone who is not Jewish, in order to hope that these people who are not Jewish will treat the Jewish people more kindly. In one of the Kabbalist classics, known as the Zohar, Z-O-H-A-R, in 80 AD, 80, which means approximately 40 years after Jeshua died on the cross, 50 years after Jeshua died on the cross, Rabbi Simeon ben Shokai wrote the following, quote, "All souls are subjects to the trials of transmigration," again, which means reincarnation. "And men do not know the designs of the Most High, meaning of God with regard to them. They do not know how they are being judged at all times before coming back into the world and when they leave it. They do not know how many transformations and mysterious trials they must undergo, which means how many new lifetimes they must experience. They do not know how many migrations and mysterious trials they must undergo for the souls to re-enter the absolute substance. To accomplish this end, it must develop into all that until it reach perfection. If they have not fulfilled this during one lifetime, they must commence another lifetime, a third, and so forth, until they acquire the condition that fits them with their reunion with God." Just think about what he's saying. And he wrote this in the 1st century AD. He's talking about the same thing that I just shared with you. When I talk about the pyramid of 1,000 steps, he's writing in the Zohar, in the Kabbalahs. We don't know how many lifetimes a person has to go, but they'll keep coming back lifetime after lifetime until they eventually reach perfection and they have a reunion, becoming one with God. Let's go back now. Let's not go back, but let's go forward now into time. In the 1600s, Rabbi Manasseh ben Israel, in the 1600s, he wrote, quote, "The belief of the doctrine of the transmigration of the souls," which means the reincarnation of souls, "is a firm and infallible dogma accepted by the whole assemblage of our religion in one accord, so there is none to be found who should dare to deny it. Indeed, there are a great number of sages in Israel who hold firm to this doctrine, so that they made into a dogma, a fundamental point in our religion. We are therefore duty-bound to obey and to accept this dogma with acclamation, as a truth that has been constantly demonstrated by the Zohar and all the books of the Kabbalists." And he wrote that in the 17th century. In the Universal Jewish Encyclopedia, it states the following, quote, "The doctrines of transmigration of souls," again meaning the reincarnation of souls, "appears often in Kabbalah, is found in organized form in the Zohar, and is also in Hasidism as a universal belief that the soul has no sex, which is determined by the body and will vary from incarnation to incarnation." Over and over again in the teachings of Judaic religion is the absolute belief in reincarnation. And today, there's only one of the three sects, of the two sects that believed in reincarnation 2,000 years ago, which was the Pharisees and the Essenes. And today, Hasidic Jews, the Jews who have you see them dressed in all black and they have the curls that hang down and they wear black hats, they still believe in reincarnation. And they were carried forward from the Judaic religion. It goes back 2,000 years ago, as well as in the 17th century, in the teachings as I've gone ahead and quoted them. Well, what happened to reincarnation? Jeshua believes in reincarnation, and the Jewish people believe in reincarnation 2,000 years ago. And I'm going to point out to you places in the New Testament where it still talks about reincarnation. Because what happened in the 4th century when the church formed, the Roman Universal Church, the word universal means Catholic in Latin. They made a deliberate decision in the 4th century. They wanted to purge everything dealing with reincarnation out of the New Testament. They wanted people to believe they had only one lifetime to lead, and that redemption and salvation could only come through the church. They felt that if the 80 million people in the Roman Empire were to accept the religion of the Roman Catholic Church, and they believed that redemption and salvation could only come through the church, and you only have one lifetime to lead, they'd have great control of the lives of people. But that reincarnation actually would be a competitor to this belief, because then people would realize that they had their own relationship with God, and that they were immortal and eternal, and there was no such thing as death, only a transition of the soul. It's written in the Old Testament, in the last chapter, in the last paragraph of Malachi, chapter 4, verse 5. It's prophesied as following. I'm going to quote to you verbatim. The prophet Elijah states, "Behold, I will send the prophet," referring to that prophet will be a reincarnation of Elijah, who would be reincarnated in order to tell the people of the coming of the Messiah. That's in the last chapter of the Old Testament, in the chapter called Malachi, where it says that the soul of the prophet of Elijah will be born again in order to tell people of the coming of the Messiah. Now I'm going to share with you the places in the New Testament where they had neglected by error. They made an effort. They hired 25 scholars over a period of 20 years to translate the New Testament, the Gospels, from ancient Latin into contemporary Latin, Vulgate Latin, and to purge it with everything dealing with reincarnation. But they missed it in several places. In Matthew chapter 16, verse 13, when Jeshua comes to the coast of Caesarea, which is along the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, he asks his disciples, quote, "Whom do men say that I am?" And they answer him, "Some say that you art thou, the prophet Elias, one of the prophets." And Jeshua answers them. They say that Elias must come first before Jeshua. Jeshua says, "No, Elias truly did come first to restore all things, but I say unto you that Elias has already come." Elias and Elijah, the same prophet, same person. "And that they did not know him. And they have done to him whatever they chose. And likewise shall I also suffer as he did." And it goes on to say the disciples knew that he was speaking to John the Baptist, who had already been beheaded, was a person who was a spirit that had been reborn again of Elijah. And then in Matthew 17, in chapter 9, after Jeshua had been doing some healings and they were passing a blind man who was standing on a corner, a man who was born blind. The disciples wanted to know if he was born blind because he committed a sin in his previous life, because his parents had sinned. Now, again, the question was he born blind as a child because of a sin he committed in his previous lifetime? And Jeshua says no, and Jeshua heals him. And says no, he was born blind to show the glory of God, and Jeshua heals him. This is another place in the New Testament where the issue of reincarnation is spoken. There's another passage I want to share with you where Joshua speaks of. They asked Joshua and John how he knew so much. How could he have so much knowledge? And he speaks and he answers a question that they say, you aren't even 50 years old, and yet you have so much knowledge. And Joshua says, I say unto you, before Abraham was, I was. Meaning he had lived a lifetime before Abraham. Again, confirming the fact that he had previous lifetimes prior to his lifetime as Joshua. As a matter of fact, Paul wrote in one of his letters in the Romans in chapter 9, he refers to the twins of Jacob and Esau that were born, and says that the Lord, before they were ever born, Jacob and Esau, the Lord loved one, and it says hated the other before they were born. But Paul would never use the word hated. But let's say he had concerns about the other one, who is Esau. And if you know the history of Jacob and Esau, maybe you understand why. But Paul wrote that in one of his letters, that God had concerns before they were ever born, that when they were still in the spirit world in their mother's womb, over the soul of Esau. Let's talk about the early church before the 4th century. One of the great teachers of the original Christian church was a man by the name of Justin Martyr. His last name was spelled M-A-R-T-Y-R. And again, I cannot tell you the research I had to do in order to get this information. But Justin Martyr died in the 2nd century. He died in the year 165 AD, when the church was just still growing. This is before the Roman Catholic Church was formed in the 4th century. So this is in the 2nd century. This great mind of Justin Martyr speaks of the soul inhabiting more than one human body, and denies on taking on the second time being born that it has a memory of its previous lifetimes. That was Justin Martyr that said that. He was one of the leaders in the church in the 2nd century, before the Roman Catholic Church was formed. Another great teacher, another great historian and writer who died in the 3rd century, before the Roman Catholic Church was formed in the 4th century, was a man by the name of Origen. His name was spelled O-R-I-G-E-N, Origen. And it's very important you remember his name, because he comes up again after the Roman Catholic Church was formed. He wrote in the 3rd century, quote, "Is it not more in conformity with reason that every soul, for certain mysterious reasons," and he's now speaking according to the opinion of Pythagoras and Plato and Empedocles, another great Greek philosopher, every soul is introduced to a body according to its deserts, meaning its rewards and former actions. Is it not rational that souls shall be introduced into new bodies in accordance with their merits and previous deeds, and those who have used their bodies in doing the most good shall have a right to bodies endowed with qualities superior to the bodies of others?" Now, I don't necessarily agree with that, but what he's saying that when a soul is reborn again, he's rewarded that he'll be born into his new lifetime and certain advantages in order to reward him. Again, I guess he's speaking of karma before he even knew what the word karma meant. That the karma will give him an opportunity to be rewarded for his past lifetimes if he did wonderful deeds in his past lifetimes, as opposed to if he did not do good deeds. He further states, again, Origen wrote this in the 3rd century, "Every soul comes into this world strengthened by the victories or weakened by his deeds of his previous life. Its work in this world determines its place in the world which is to follow in his next lifetime." Is that not amazing that your early Christian leaders were saying these things in the 3rd century and the 2nd century before the Roman Catholic Church was ever founded? The There's so much information I should share with you, and I don't want to share information to the point where you become actually burnt out and say, this is too much, Nick, enough is enough. But what happened is that after the church went ahead and was founded in the 4th century, they made a deliberate decision that they did not want to have Christianity continue to believe in the reincarnation as a possibility. And what they did in the 4th century, they had in the Fifth Ecumenical Council in Constantinople in the year 553 AD. Justinian was the emperor at that time, and they passed 13 anathemas. The word anathema means a curse on you. And the very first one they passed, the very first resolution they passed, and that was in 553 AD, that if anyone continues to preach or to teach the reincarnation of souls, there'll be an anathema on them, meaning they'll be cursed. And the Oxford Dictionary specifically states they will be explicitly condemned by the church if they continue to believe in if they continue to preach reincarnation. I actually have the actual words. There were 159 bishops that showed up. It was on May 5th of 553 AD that they passed that. 165 bishops. 159 of them were for the eastern part of the church, because the ones from the western part, which are the ones from Rome, they would not participate. They felt it was wrong that they were going to pass that particular resolution. So as a result of that, we do not have reincarnation being taught today in the Christian church. And I think it's time for truth. Reincarnation plays such an important part in our lives, because it's the only way that we can have the opportunity as we have a transmission of soul, because there's no such thing as death. Only a transition of soul where that we eventually are reborn again into a newborn baby in order to continue our mission, which is to ascend and to be able to continue to evolve spiritually until we reach the top of that pyramid to become at one with God in Christ consciousness.